2014 is the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Act. It's the 60th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. These are major, major milestones in American history. And the Bat Center is doing a lot of events right now in conjunction with freedom and independence and equality, especially equality. So, without further ado, I'm Joseph Ellis, an assistant professor of political science here at Wingate. I'm honored to be able to welcome Ryan McGee of ESPN and ESPN the magazine, and welcome back to Wingate two-time all-conference basketball player, Marshall Thaxton. Ryan is a well-known and versatile journalist specializing in NASCAR, college football, and college baseball coverage. He has won 2 sports Emmys and is the author of the book, The Road to Omaha, Hits, Hopes, and History at the College World Series, and ESPN Ultimate NASCAR, 100 Defining Moments in Stock Car Racing History. Ryan is also featured prominently in ESPN's recent SEC Storied programming. Marshall Thaxton is a native of Durham, North Carolina, and played on the 1970 and 1971 Wingate basketball teams, when Wingate was still a junior college. Thaxton was the second African-American basketball player to suit up for Wingate, following John Green, who started in 1969. Thaxton was a star player for those 70 and 71 clubs. Several articles from the Monroe Inquirer-Journal attest to this fact. So I went to the newspaper today and found this article here. Moon, Thaxton, carry Wingate to 87-71 win over Sandhills. Here was the stat line for that night, by the way. Maybe Marshall remembers this game. Marshall Thaxton, 10 field goals, 12 rebounds, 23 points. It's a double-double. And another editorial which described him, this editorial somewhere here, from a man named Sid Hart, which described Marshall as one of the biggest contributions to the 1970-1971 season. My reason for hosting tonight's event was prompted by a program I saw on ESPN about a year ago on a Tennessee football player named Condredge Holloway. Condredge, an African-American 2-sport star from Huntsville, Alabama, was not the first black player in college football or even on his own Tennessee team. He was, however, the first black quarterback to lead an SEC program, a groundbreaking achievement. This led me to wonder, who were Wingate's first black athletes? What did they accomplish? And shouldn't our students know more about them? And this leads us to tonight's event, to discuss race and sport, not only in Wingate's history, but also in athletics more generally. Before we go any further, I want to thank David Sherwood, Bill Nash, and Steve Poston for their help with this event. And a special welcome to Rollin Chanel, wave, who coached the 1971 Wingate basketball team, which featured Marshall. Without further ado, let's welcome to the stage Ryan McGee and Marshall Thaxton. So here's how it's going to go tonight. We're going to have a discussion between ourselves, I guess, for the first 30 or 40 minutes, and then we're going to open it up totally to questions from the audience. So hopefully the discussion we spark here will spark your own interest in having a question. So let's start with a simple one. Marshall, how'd you get to Wingate? Where are you from?
I'm from Durham, North Carolina. I played high school basketball at what was then known as Durham High School. And back then, I think I was the second player that achieved certain things there that was African American. So the transition from high school to Wingate was very easy for me because in the neighborhood I lived in, I did grow up in a mixed neighborhood in Durham. Po folks, as we used to say, but it was a mixed, integrated neighborhood, so being around other people, other races was not a big issue to me. And I was actually encouraged by family and the minister of the church to consider Wingate, particularly since this corridor from Charlotte around 74 into Wadesboro is so notorious as being very racist and very hard on blacks. So a lot of people felt like I had the character to, withstand some issues that I would encounter here. not necessarily on campus, but in this community and around this area.
Okay. When you came to Wingate, John Green was already on the basketball team.
That's correct.
And he was the first African-American basketball player at Wingate. There couldn't have been a lot of other black students or athletes, for that matter, on Wingate's campus at the time.
No. John was on an academic scholarship. Very smart guy, electrical engineer major, went on to state. By the third year, after the junior year, matter of fact, he dropped out of state and started a cab service, which he ended up, with my recollection, with about maybe 12 to 14 cabs in service at any given time. So John was a very good student. He was what I wish I was. See, I came into Wingate as an athlete, but I left as a student.
So what was the experience like? Ups, downs, basketball and everything in between in your 2 years here?
Expectations. You know, I was the first male in my family to go to college. I'm from a family of 9 kids. I was the 6th child, the 3rd son, but I was the first to have an opportunity to finish high school, complete high school, and, you know, move forward and go to college. So for me personally, it was all about dealing with challenges and understanding this was a way for me to get where ultimately I wanted to go. And in my head back then, you know, the 3 things I wanted to do was teach and coach, travel, and join the police department. So ultimately I did all 3 things.
Your experiences here, how did they, you went on to play at UNC Charlotte, correct?
That's correct.
How did your experiences here shape you later on in life?
I think as I look back, I thoroughly enjoyed my time here. I will simply say I enjoyed my time here for me it was a transition from being an athlete to being a little bit more serious being a student. I was fortunate enough to be here with my freshman roommate, Lewis Tucker. He was the first guy running the track here on the full scholarship, or half scholarship. And I saw Cleveland Cunningham's picture up, and Cleveland was also more or less a walk-on for the track team, but he too had some aid from the school. I saw an opportunity, and I'll simply say that. I saw an opportunity to go where I wanted to go, do some things, and as Tucker used to say, everybody likes you, man. So I pushed it.
All right, let's turn the floor now to Ryan McGee for a second. Ryan, you cover a lot of different sports, but I guess the one in your wheelhouse would be NASCAR. And this is a sport that I think a lot of people would consider sort of a white, southern, male sport.
They would be right.
But that's not always been the case,
Yep.
I guess.
Over the years, it's funny with the NASCAR Hall of Fame opening in Charlotte, which you need to go, even if you don't care anything about it. It's great before it goes bankrupt. But in the case of NASCAR, you know, they've been in this tough spot the last few years where Wendell Scott is the only African American to win a top what's now Sprint Cup race, Jacksonville, Florida, 1961. And that night they wouldn't let him celebrate. You know, that night Buck Baker, who is in the Hall of Fame, filed a protest, which he liked to do, and that was very convenient because it gave NASCAR an opportunity to let Buck Baker do Victory Lane, let him kiss the girls, let him get the trophy and leave, and a few hours later announce, oh wait, we made a mistake, Wendell Scott won the race. Never got his trophy. Now, 50 years later, almost 60 years later, the sport has embraced his family. And this touchy spot I'm talking about is over the last few years, we had some anniversaries, you know, concerning Wendell's win, and you wanted to celebrate it, but at the same time, you know, the only African American to win a race, and by the way, he's still the only one, and it's been almost 50 years. You know, so it was an interesting spot. But the good news for NASCAR and for motorsports in general is that as slow as it's been, I think about when I first started on the road, going to every race in the mid-90s. There was no diversity in the garage whatsoever. You know, there wasn't any diversity in the grandstands, there wasn't any diversity in the media center, and how much that's changed just in the 18 years I've been out there. And Darrell Wallace Jr. is a name you're going to hear a lot. He became the second African-American driver finally last year to win a race on a national level, not in the Cup Series, but in the Truck Series, which is kind of like AAA baseball. There's only 3 national series, and that's one of them. But also when you walk down pit road and you see officials who are women and who are African-American, and you see pit crew members. These teams have gotten very aggressive through a Wingate alum, actually, at Hendrick Motorsports, of going and trying to find good former college athletes. And as a result, you're starting to see diversity on pit road because they don't care what your background is as long as you can get over that wall and change 4 tires. And so it's changed dramatically, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years. Still a long way to go, but it's much better than it was.
You see it in the stands too?
Yeah, and I think that if Darrell Wallace Jr. does what I think he's capable of doing, and he is, to your point about, wanting you to come here because you knew you could handle it. In Darrell's case, he can handle it. And I don't think the resistance is going to be what maybe people might fear, and he doesn't think so either. Listen, he's just a redneck, and he laughs about it all the time. His name is, but he don't want to be called Darrell, he wants to be called Bubba. It's Bubba Wallace. That's his Twitter handle. And he's from Tennessee, and he's a volunteer fan, which is good because I'm a Tennessee grad, and he knows all about it. He met Condridge Holloway last year, and really was discovered by Wendell Scott's family. Wendell Jr. Spends a lot of time, still does. Wendell tried to become a driver, but he spends a lot of time scouting talent. And he spotted Darrell Wallace Jr. when he was 14, 15 years old and kind of put him on NASCAR's radar. And as a result, he's racing for Joe Gibbs and doing a great job.
Marshall, when you see people like Darrell Wallace Jr. succeed, even though it's a different sport, do you feel gratification in that you went through maybe some initial hardships, but someone 2 generations down the road can experience things like that?
Of course. So much has changed in the world since I started out as an athlete in junior high school and high school. I look around back then, we would play on teams that would be all white. We would be playing against teams that were all white. Then you look around the coaching and the referees, they were all white. Now I come here, I know there's an assistant coach that's African American. I've met him a couple of times, and the change, these people, these kids, they don't understand it. Bill Nash was around when I came through, and pretty decent person back then. Baseball player, but he was forgiven. He could have played basketball. But I look at people taking advantage of opportunities. Some people are born with it in the sense of they have the family connections that push them in a certain way. Then you got others who fight to get in, like Wendell Scott. Right. He fought to get in, and he took advantage of his opportunity the best he could at that time. And we're talking about time sensitivity here, where things start slowly and they echo and just kept rolling, until now you're seeing basketball players, all 4 levels in college, junior colleges, coaching, NBA. I can remember so often wondering when some things would get better. I manned the picket sign when I was probably 10 years old, and chased by people with cars and dogs and weapons. I was never struck, never hit, because I was pretty quick.
And pretty big, it seems like.
Not at that time, but I always remember looking around to see the opportunities that were there. If you just give a guy a chance, And I remember the first black quarterback when I was in junior high school. Natural leader, best guy on the team for quarterbacking. They wouldn't give this kid a chance to play quarterback until the third game of our 9th grade year, when the other 2 kids had gotten hurt. And we blew people out. Because again, he had the opportunity to play without anybody putting a thumb on him and telling him he can't do it. You know, these are things that I remember. You know,
This word that he used, opportunity, and shameless plug time, but in the ESPN magazine this month, I brought this today. That's James Harris. You remember James Harris? Yeah, James Harris, Hack Harris was first African-American quarterback to start a playoff game, played for the Chargers. And the reason I brought this in was because I wanted to make sure I brought it in because Steve Wolf, who's one of our senior writers at ESPN magazine, one day should be in the Baseball Hall of Fame. The way this interview starts off with James Harris, and we wrote this prior to the Super Bowl. Harris is in the front office of the Detroit Lions now, but the way the interview starts is Steve asks Hack Harris, he just starts his intro, and Harris immediately says, "Now I don't want to talk about racism. I want to talk about opportunity." And that's how the interview started, and that's how he wanted to frame it. And to that exact same story, just on a higher level, when you read this story and you realize how good he was, and the fact that they traded an All-Pro to Green Bay to make room for him, and they gave him about a season, and he got him to the playoffs, and should have won should have gotten to the Super Bowl, honestly, that year. But the owner of the team,
Gloria Fontanella,
essentially said, "Congratulations, that was great," and then immediately turned to Chuck Knox and said, "We got to get rid of him." And James Harris talks about how it crushed his spirit. But he knew, and this is why we interviewed him for the magazine for this issue, but he looks at Russell Wilson, he looks at Colin Kaepernick, and he looks at Cam Newton, and these guys. There's an African-American quarterback in the Super Bowl almost every single year now. And this is what he said. He said, ultimately, he's been able to deal with the disappointment and the fact that they put so many roadblocks in his way in the early 70s because of what he sees now. And Darrell Wallace Jr., to that point, when I talked to Russell Wilson, I talked to they're the first ones to say, to give credit where credit's due, and also the first ones to say, I'm not even going to pretend like this is as hard as it was for the people that came before us, because it's not.
A long way from Doug Williams.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
that awkward question at the Super Bowl.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But there's an interesting graphic our art department did in this issue, and it breaks down playoff starts over like the last 20 years, and it's an amazing thing to watch it build. And now it's to the point, my daughter's here tonight, she's 9. She didn't think anything of it. And I think about how different it is even, I was a teenager when Doug, did what he did. I've known Condridge Holloway we tried to get him here tonight. I've known Condridge Holloway for a long time, and he and I have talked about the fact that, just with each generation, knock on wood, it becomes, it's not a thing. Hopefully we'll all live to see that point.
And sticking on this theme, and maybe after this question we can open it up to the audience, and hopefully we'll have a fruitful discussion there. But the Condridge Holloway story is interesting because Alabama's going to give him a scholarship to play football.
Right.
He just can't be a quarterback.
Right.
And so George Battle goes down and says, you can play quarterback here, and the rest is history. And he goes and plays for the Vols instead of the Tide. And I think if you think about that now, that's crazy. You're getting the best player you can in the position. But I don't know if there's a question here, but it's just an interesting course of events. And
Bill Battle, the coach that gave him the break, is the athletic director at Alabama now. And Coach Battle loves to tell that story, and he loves to tell the stories. Not bragging. He just to be a part of it, to be a part of the shift, is a big deal. Particularly, and these are my people, particularly down in the SEC.
Yeah. Maybe one more question, then we'll open it up to the audience. About the same time that Marshall is starting his career at Wingate, there's a very famous college football game between USC and Alabama that really changes everything. You want to talk about that? Marshall, you can talk about it. Ryan, you can talk about it.
Well, I think the quarterback was Jimmy, what's the kid's name? From Michigan or USC.
Ooh. I'm not going to say when I was born, but it wasn't.
What I remember way back was when Alabama was playing for the national title, and I think either Michigan or USC, traditionally was there anyway, but either Michigan or USC had a quarterback that wanted to play here in North Carolina, and he was not allowed to come in and play quarterback at State nor UNC. This kid goes on to either Michigan or USC, great college career, moves on and plays Alabama in the national championship. And that's when joke comes out about Bear Bryant after this kid runs about a 100-yard touchdown and beats the crap out of Alabama. He turns to the coach and said, I got to get me one of them.
Yeah.
So the rest is history. He began to recruit African-American athletes and at the skill positions because of that performance of that one kid.
When it had to bring USC in, the problem he had was selling it on everybody else. And had to bring USC into Birmingham or Tuscaloosa and get thumped. And basically, I remember thanked John McKay after the game because he said, now I can do what it is that I want to do. Now, he had to get his brains beat out to change his mind about how he felt about it. But you know, winning fixes a lot of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And it's, you know, at the end of the day, regardless of your color, you want to win and you want to have great players.
And what's interesting about you getting these footholds to make changes is happening in the most unusual places. You know, you coming here, and Nolan Richardson doing what he did out in, you know, West Texas and Arkansas and these places, and of course, you know, the great my friend Dan Wetzel with Yahoo Sports wrote the book Glory Row, which became a movie, and we're talking about you know, the first starting five to play in the national championship game at what's now UTEP. Had to happen at UTEP. You know, and the funniest part of the book is when those kids get out there and are like, what are we doing? You know, in El Paso, but it's picking those spots, and Nolan Richardson has talked about that a lot, about picking those spots and having to pick those unusual places to kind of make your stand, you know, to convince the folks, you know, in other places that this is how you need to do it.
And two of the most prominent coaches in their sports, Adolph Rupp and Bear Bryant, kind of turned that for everyone else. Adolph Rupp and Bear Bryant realized we can't compete anymore. And I think Pat Riley was on that team.
He was. Yeah. But again, Adolph Rupp had to lose. Still took him a little while, I think, to come around.
Yeah.
I'm Sophie. Was there anyone in particular who inspired you to come to Wingate?
For me, yes. Coach Bill Cannell, he's deceased now, actually recruited me after seeing our team perform in the state playoffs. My situation was athletic talent, but I did not particularly focus very much on academics. I just wanted to get by. As a senior, I realized, you know, that wasn't the way to go, and I started changing. Well, actually, it goes, my junior year, I was expelled from school. Now, I'll be frank. I was expelled, not suspended, expelled, which meant I could not go to school in the city. And my mom told me that Tuesday night. She said, I don't have to tell you, Dad, I'm wait till Friday. I thought about the difference between two of my sisters. One finished college, one dropped out of high school, married, kids. The one finished college, PhD and all this good stuff, traveled the world and all that stuff. I saw the difference in the lifestyles. And I knew that if I didn't straighten up, I was going to slide downward instead of moving upward. What I remember was the dean telling me he let me in school, and I said 3 times, no, Dean, I'm not going to come back and run track. And this is the dean of men who's the head track coach. He said, Marshall, he said, son, you don't understand. I'll let you back in school. This is my junior year. If you run track for me, he said it 3 times. And when I leaned forward the 3rd time to say, no, I don't want to run track, I got a left hook from my mother that hit me in my jaw, harder than I ever hit in my life. And I looked at her, and I had a reconsideration real quick. And I turned to the dean, and I said, well, Coach, what you want me to run? And I think somewhere back there, I finished 3rd or 4th in the high jumping state. And, you know, the potential was there. Wingate, after my senior year, you know, the last game, what are you going to do? I want to go to school. I do not want to go to Vietnam. If you didn't go to school, you were going to end up in the Army, et cetera. You know the routine there, Vietnam. That's not what I saw for myself. I came home one day, and my father would come home from Liggett and Myers's tobacco factory in Durham and sit on the front porch, read the paper, put his feet up on the banister, smoke his pipe. And I turned the corner one day, and several other guys, athletes, were walking with me, and Thax, who was that at your house? I said, hell, I don't know. Make a long story short, it was Coach Bill Cannell. In a 3-week period, at least 4 times, this man was there, you know, showing the effort and talking to me about coming here, potentially issues that I would have to deal with. And he was assured by the coaches at my high school that, you know, talked about once I get motivated, how I could, you know, probably be okay. I came to Wingate for a visit, and this is the truest and the funniest story. Andy Sullivan and I came to Wingate. We hung around and had a nice visit. And that Saturday, Coach came by the dorm and picked us up and took us to his house. And we sat there, and his wife says, you know, Marshall, how do you like your steak? And this is an honest to God story. And I said, ma'am, how do you like your steak? I looked around and said, you know, with gravy. I didn't know. So she turns and asks Andy Solomon. He's now a police captain in Greensboro. Andy, how do you like your steak? Same economic conditions. I was black, he was white. Andy said, with gravy and mushrooms. We didn't know. In my family, if there was a steak, it had been left out for 3 days, pounded with tenderizer, beat with the mallets. Y'all probably remember, Coach. And yardstick come out once it was cooked, and everybody got, you know, so much. Miss Cannell came out with a steak, a baked potato on a plate, and a thing of rolls. She set the steak and potato in front of me and the rolls in the middle of the table. If Andy Solomon was here, he would tell you this story. He said, I looked at him and he knew right then I wanted to kill him because I wanted that whole steak. And they brought out one for Coach, one for Miss Cannell, and one for Andy. But what I'm trying to say is, because of that meal, and I said, boy, if they eat like that at Wingate, I'm coming to school here. And the joke of the day is, you know, I came to school a small forward center, and by the time I finished college, I looked more like a tight end. So, a defensive end. So, first time in my life, I had all the food and orange juice and milk I could drink. That's why I came to Wingate. No, kidding somewhat, but I saw the opportunity to, several friends of mine had gone on to major 4-year schools from my high school, playing Division I basketball. I was offered a major scholarship to one of the schools up north and several smaller schools down south. I said, there has to be another way, and my coach said to me, Marshall, what about a junior college? I never heard of one, never knew what it was. Shortly thereafter was when several came around and I met Coach Cannell. After that, he started showing up at my house, sitting there. He recruited my parents by coming to their house, put his feet up, read the paper with my dad, smoke his pipe, and those two guys would be talking. So there was a conspiracy. By the time I came home, I was headed to Wingate. So I was done.
You were done.
Mm-hmm. Question.
Again, it's that word opportunities. And for those of you that don't know, my dad works here. And but
one real nice to you, Ron.
Yeah. But one of the reasons that he took the job, 20 some odd years ago was because this is the part of the state that we're from. My family's all down east, Rockingham, Clinton, Fayetteville. I grew up in Raleigh, and it's the idea of creating opportunities for, again, didn't matter what color the skin were, but for people in this part of the state that didn't, so many people even today grow up thinking college isn't even an option, and there's nowhere to go. So it's that same type of idea. You mentioned the book, The Road to Omaha, that I wrote about the College World Series, and that book ended up becoming really a history of the city of Omaha from a sports perspective. North Omaha, at the North Omaha YMCA, produced Bob Gibson, and it produced Johnny Rogers, won the Heisman, produced Gale Sayers, maybe, in my opinion, greatest pure running back of all time. But all these kids,
X, I think.
yeah, well, all these kids came out of this one YMCA, and it was because of Bob Gibson's brother, Josh, who basically sacrificed his future to convince all these kids this isn't it, and convince Bob, who could be very bitter, go to Creighton down the road, go to college, even though you could go play minor league ball, and you know, obviously things worked out for Bob Gibson. But again, it's that idea of just creating opportunities and making you understand that, you know, that there's something better out there. Just because everybody else is, you know, for lack of a better word, settling because they don't know any better, you don't have to do that.
Like any new group of people, it takes a while for people to accept, get acquainted, start socializing, not just on the basketball court, but i.e. in the cafeteria, walking around campus, etc. Now here I am with 5, 6 black kids, 1,500, I forgot the number of students back then, that were not minorities. They hadn't been up close to an African-American male. They hadn't been up close to an African-American female. They've seen a few people in some cases. They've seen them, but they hadn't interacted. And I remember a girl saying to me one day that she wanted to touch my hair. And I was surprised, you know. And I was aware that certain parts of this state, you still had a lot of issues that people had not gotten through yet. And that's what I felt like when I came here. I was very aware of the situation on the road just a few years earlier with Robert Williams. Very aware of that. This was a notorious corridor between Wadesboro and Mecklenburg County line. Very notorious if you were an African American. Campus-wise, very, very few incidents. The one I remember coming down, because this has been so long ago and I hadn't really thought about a lot of this, one thing I remember was crossing by the cafeteria, maybe walking back from the gym, I don't know. John Green was with me. So it was probably my freshman year. And car pulled around the curve, makes a right turn, headed out toward where friends of mine still live, past the Helms dorms and all those, and they threw beer cans and racial epithets. I was not stunned, but I was surprised. This kind of behavior was symptomatic here in the South and in the North. But on campus, it only occurred one time. I can remember sitting in the cafeteria many a day. Dr. Parthenia Richardson was sitting with Sue. I was sitting over with Kelby, Jerry, Bill, all of us sitting there talking. And I remember I happened to look up and I saw this guy sneering, just a mean look on his face. I didn't think nothing of it. But a few minutes later, when I looked up again, I just walked over. I wasn't afraid. I think that's what I'm trying to say. And I wasn't confrontational, but I wasn't going to take anybody's crap. I wasn't. And once the guy understood, we're going to have an issue. In 2 years I was here, the guy, to my recollection, never said a thing to me. I saw this same guy 2 years later when I was dragging my leg up at, tore my knee up. We were up at, UNCC was up at Appalachian, and this guy walked up to me and said, "Man, I'm sorry." You know, people change, but they change their own levels and their own reasons. And again, this guy was just looking at it like I didn't belong. You know, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, Holmes, you know, we are going to have some issues here. But this simplistic answer, most of us who were students at Wingate were pretty dang good students. So to get here and get in and to get out, we had to be decent people and decent students. So for the most part, on campus, super time, great time.
To the question about coaches, I think that what makes the Jackie Robinson story even more remarkable is the fact that so little changed outside of baseball for so long. That's the part of it that it stuns people, I think, when they realize that Jackie Robinson did what he did in 1947, as opposed to the other stories we're talking about. We're talking about 1970. We're talking about Doug Williams in the mid 80s. And then when you start talking about coaches, particularly at the NFL level, in Major League Baseball, which with the exception of Frank Robinson, resisted Major League managers for a long time. And so it's just, again, it's kind of picking the spot where you're going to make your stand. We're talking about it kind of in these unusual places and small places and rural places and working your way in. And in the case of particularly Major League sports, you had to convince them first that black athletes could play at all. Then you had to convince them they could have leadership positions on the field. And then eventually, you start infiltrating, for lack of a better term, the front office. I talked to Ozzie Newsome about this, who of course is a great player and the architect of these great Baltimore Ravens teams. He keeps a framed portrait of Bear Bryant in his office. And when I interviewed him, we talked about that. And he said, if that man can change the way he thought about things, then I knew we could change the way the NFL thought about things. And now, I talked to Marvin Lewis, the coach of the Bengals, on the phone 2 days ago for a piece that I'm working on. And it's just, sometimes you made a great point about it. Different people have different timetables, and the same for different levels of have different timetables. And in the case of the front offices and coaches, the front office still needs some help. But on the sideline now, it's amazing how much different it is, even versus just 10 years ago. But you don't want to sound crass, but there's just certain generations need to get out of the way, because those myths about leadership and all those clips. I was at the University of Tennessee 20 years ago, and we had a guy I went to school with named Jerry Colquitt. And Jerry was a backup quarterback. Unfortunately, he was there behind Heath Schuler, who almost won the Heisman. And then he was there behind, Jerry's claim to fame was he waited 4 years to be a starter. He was finally the starter, and he blew his knee out first drive of the first series of the year, and Peyton Manning took over.
The rest is history.
But even when I was in school, which I like to think wasn't that long ago, but relatively it wasn't. But even 20 years ago, you still heard it on call-in radio shows.
Wade Houston.
Yeah,
Wade Houston,
right. When I was in school, Wade Houston became the head basketball coach at Tennessee, and you still heard those things. And they weren't very good. It wasn't his fault. They weren't very good.
He couldn't get into the country.
Yeah. And even the things that I heard then, you wouldn't hear it now. You just wouldn't. And it took, and this was what amazed me about Jerry's situation, Jerry Colquitt, who's one of the finest people I ever knew in school, was that this was the school that produced Condredge Holloway. And now in 1990, we're still going to make a big deal out of this. And that part was just hard for me to wrap my brain around. But it's, again, the good news is it's not the place that it used to be. There's still work to do, but it's certainly better than it was.
Okay.
Hey, I want to respond a little bit more to what he asked about politics and sports. For me, I think back to Muhammad Ali. Outspoken, very skillful, Islamic, black male, dominated boxing, just like Jack Johnson did, 50 years before him. Politically, nothing he ever did as an athlete at that time was good enough to overcome obstacles that were placed in front of him by other people. These people were in control. I sit back and I remember the fella's dead now, Helms. There were so many negative issues. I know he's a great supporter of this institution concerning him that, to me, for the rest of my life, I will always have an issue with his memory. because no matter how good you were as an athlete, you were quickly dismissed because of the color of your skin. Again, naturally, certain sports are going to have more athletes, shall we say, African-American athletes, because that's what we have in our neighborhoods. We have football and basketball areas. Otley Bell, hadn't been mentioned yet so far, was a terrific tennis player. He was the first black guy that I saw. Then John Lucas came along, who was a tennis phenomenon. Areas such as that, when I look at what these two sisters, Serena and her sister, are doing, I applaud them. Yeah, I don't remember the split she did, but I just remember what they do on the court. And, you know, we still have golf. You know, people love Tiger Woods or they hate Tiger Woods. You know, the Williams sisters, they love him or they hate him. And I don't think it's necessarily all about their skill as athletes. You know, there are just too many other factors there that people key in on, and they automatically pick a side. You know, and it's still occurring. You know, racism is not dead. Racism is still here. It's not as prevalent. Usually it's not as violent as it used to be until you and I relate this kid, Trayvon Martin. You know, classic example. That kid never should have been killed. And then the guy never should have been found not guilty. I'm retired homicide. You know, you still have incidents where certain bigoted ideas are allowed to still fester and grow. And as people, I'm going to simply say that we need to continue working on it. You know, Black History Month is great, but it should be all year round. You know, it's still a lot that has to be done. And we need, again, younger people pushing these old folks up and out. Don't kill them, but just push them up and out.
How the hell?
Is that a good final word?
Well, and I'll say the last place left that I see, I mentioned NFL front offices, and I think that's taking care of it. It's going to take care of itself because there's too many talented coaches that one day are going to be administrators. But in collegiate athletics, the NCAA does a great job. You walk through the office in Indianapolis, and you know, any background you want is there. As long as they're smart, they get a job. Damani Leach essentially going to take over the football and baseball stuff is what I deal with. But you go to a conference commissioners meeting, and you go to a meeting of, I'm talking about top Division I athletic directors, and pushing them up and out, that I'm waiting on it because that's there right now, and I think that's why, quite honestly, you see still some old school ideas that are antiquated.
And college boosters play a role in that.
Well, that too, yeah. But again, I'm hoping that time, by the time my daughter's my age, I'm hoping that that conversation is one we have to have.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Poston. Thank you, Bill Nash. Thank you, David Sherwood, for helping me with this. Thank you, Coach Chanel, for coming back. Thank you, Ryan McGee. Thank you, Marshall Thaxton.